It is good to see each and every one of you. I am glad to be able to be here today and to be able to speak. Personally, I think I have one of the best assignments in the whole batch. And also maybe one of the best hours. I was talking to someone earlier, I forget, and I'm a morning person. I usually get up about 4:30. And I think in the morning, our minds are a lot sharper. We have had a good night's rest, and we have the opportunity to wake up. I know that Jim, I don't see him in here, but oh, there he is. Jim had to get some coffee to jumpstart his brain, but the rest of us, I think we are already going. But I'm glad to be here and to be able to speak on the subject I have been assigned. I'd like to ask you some questions. Who knows not only the day you were born, the hour you were born? Who knows the very first word you spoke, the very first step you took? Who has been there at every major event in your life? Now, a lot of people might think, well, that's Mom. And, well, yeah, Mom probably was. Does fit all that. But the answer is God. You take and think about it. Mom gave you birth. God gave you life. Mom knows a lot about you. God knows all about you. If you're like me, there are some things that my mom did not know, and I just assumed she never did know. Things that I did before I became a Christian. But you know what? God knows all things. In the book of Psalms, 139, which is where my assignment is, Psalm 139, verse 7, excuse me, David is contemplating the omniscience and the omnipresence of God. And in verse 7 it says, "Whither shall I go from thy spirit? Or whither shall I flee from thy presence?" Now, as with a lot of the speakers I've heard, we're not going to start there. We're going to lay a little background before we get there. And really what I would like for us to do is begin in verse 1. David says, "O Lord, thou hast searched me and known me." When David writes this, he is saying that God had already searched him, already knows him. He says, "Thou hast searched me and known me." Matter of fact, looking over to verse 13. Matter of fact, we're going to look at verses 13 through 16. He says, "For thou hast possessed my reins, thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. My substance was not hid from thee when I was made in secret, and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect. And in thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there was none of them." Now, taking and looking at these verses, but thinking about what it says there in verse 1, David says, "Thou hast searched me and known me." God knew David from conception. He says here in these verses, in verse 13, which verse 13 in many translations is translated similarly to what it says in the New King James Version, where it says, "For you formed my inward parts. You covered me in my mother's womb." Now, the King James Version says, "For thou hast possessed my reins." Now, I happen to believe that it is probably a better translation. I think it's more in context of what it's talking about, and the way that the New King James does translate that. "For you form my inward parts." I think it follows what is being said here. "For you form my inward parts. You covered me in my mother's womb." I think he is talking about his being conceived and his development from that conception. That God did form his inward parts, the organs themselves, and also covered him, as it says there, in his mother's womb. God covered him with skin and bone, all a part of the development of the fetus, the embryo. I think it's very similar to what is said back in Job chapter 10 and verse 11. Job 10, verse 11. Thou hast clothed me with skin and flesh, and hast fenced me with bones and sinews. I believe he's talking here about the fact that God knew him from conception. When he was conceived, it began to form those inward parts. When those inward parts began to form, that God knew him. David here is contemplating how God is his creator, his maker. And God, as he says there in verse 1, he had searched him and known him. God knew him from conception. And when God chose him to be king, God had knew David all along. Knew everything David ever did. God sends Samuel in 1 Samuel 16, 6 through 12 to anoint David. Although he did not know it was David. And he comes to the house of Jesse, David's father. And the sons of Jesse come before him. And evidently, Samuel thought that, well, this is the providence of God. The first one that came along said, well, surely this is him. God says, no. All of the sons of Jesse come before him. No, none of these. Samuel says, do you have any other sons? He says, well, yeah, I have one more. He's out taking care of the sheep. He says, well, send for him. Because we're not going to sit down until he comes. So they send for David, and David comes, and of course David was the one that God chose. And it makes an interesting statement. It says that God does not look at the outward appearance, but God looks at the inward appearance. God knew David from conception. And when you take and think about man is an amazing thing. When you take and think about the complexity of what God has made. You know, the brain might be compared to a computer, but it falls very short of a computer. Earlier, Jack was trying to get his computer to come up, and he was sitting there tapping on it. He actually took it and the keyboard and was kind of bumping it on the table. It wasn't wanting to work. Well, sometimes we might want to bang our heads against the wall, but you know, our brains are an amazing thing. They work very well. A computer you might buy, and in a year it's already out of date. I mean, it's an antique. But our brains continue to work. They're an amazing thing. The eye can be compared to a camera, but it's far better than any camera you might ever buy. The skin, it keeps the blood in, it keeps the moisture out, it replaces itself. It is our first line of defense in our immune system. We could talk about the nervous system, the DNA. Man is an amazing thing, and God has made us. And David is contemplating that. And he says in verse 14, I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. When we take and think about what God has done in making us, when we truly contemplate what the human body is able to do and how God has designed us, we ought to all be like David. We ought to give God the praise that He deserves. But He says, I will praise Thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. He says, marvelous are Thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. But then in verse 15, he says, my substance was not hid from Thee when I was made in secret, and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. His substance. He did not say the blob. He says, my substance. My substance was not hid from Thee. It was not a blob that became David. It was a substance that was David. It just wasn't completely formed yet. David says, my substance was not hid from Thee. You know, when we are conceived, it is a secret to men, but God knows when we are conceived. Even God knows when we are conceived, even before our mothers knew that we were conceived. But he's talking about the development of that life. Kyle and Dillich compare it to a piece of metal that had not been shaped yet into a vessel. The substance was there from which which David was. That was David, not just completely formed yet. But that substance was there. It just had not been completely formed yet. In Jeremiah chapter 1 and verse 5, it says, "Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee." That is life. It begins at conception. David is pondering this. There's a political ad out right now, and I'm not getting into politics, but I want to use a point out of it. In this political ad, it is an ad trying to show the flaw, I guess you might say, in this woman that's running for an office. And it says that this woman did not vote against abortion at 21 weeks. And it goes on to talk about how at 21 weeks there are fingers and there are toes and there's a heartbeat and the mother can feel that baby kicking. Well, I'm not going to preach on abortion, but I think the point is obvious. Life begins at conception. David is talking about how God knew him, and God knew him from conception. And God knows us. God has known us from conception. He has known us throughout our lives. He has known us up to this very moment. God knows everything about us. He knows everything we have ever done and everything we have ever said. Really, God knows us better than we know ourselves. But that's just verse 1. David says, "Thou hast searched me and known me." But that knowledge that God had of David and of us is an ongoing knowledge. Look at verse 2. He says, "Thou knowest my down sitting and my uprising." You all are sitting right now. In a few minutes, you'll be standing up. And that's really what David's talking about. He knows when I'm sitting, he knows when I'm standing. Aren't those the basic actions that people do? The very basic, normal things that we do on a daily basis. We sit, we stand, we walk, and all these things. Just the basic things. But he says here, "Thou knowest." These are the normal, everyday things, but they do not go unnoticed by God. You know, it's not that God just tunes in to our lives whenever we do something big. God knows everything we do, from sitting to standing. He goes on, "Thou understandest my thoughts afar off." Not that God is afar off, our thoughts are afar off. They are not complete yet. While our thoughts are still forming, when they're still being put together, God knows them. God knows our thoughts before we know them. God knew Cyrus was going to build Jerusalem long before Cyrus was even ever born. He knew that Judas was going to betray Jesus long before Judas was ever born. God knows our thoughts afar off. He goes on here, he says, "Thou compassest my path and my lying down." The word compassest there is defined as cast away, compass, disperse, fan, scatter, spread, strew, winnow. Kind of reminds me of a farmer that is separating the chaff from the wheat. Right now it's harvest time here in Missouri. I have a brother-in-law has a farm down at Latour. If you've never heard of Latour, don't feel alone. A lot of people haven't. But he has a pretty good-sized farm down there. They're harvesting corn right now. But you take and think about what a combine does. It's going down through that field and it's cutting that corn off and it separates all that. And what ends up in the back? The corn. It separates all that. It's what a combine does. Well, here he's talking about how God disperses, fans, scatters, spreads, strews, winnows, separates His path and His lying down. God knew the good and the bad that David did. He separates it. He knows the good and He knows the bad. God knew when David killed Goliath, but God also knew when he committed adultery with Bathsheba. God knows the good and the bad that we do. God knows when we might give a cup of cold water to someone, for instance, for it says, a cup of cold water shall not lose its reward. But God also knows when we sin, doesn't He? And that ought to motivate us to be the best people we can be, to be the best children of God that we can be. God knows these things. He says, Thou art acquainted with all my ways. For there is not a word in my tongue, He says, but lo, O Lord, Thou knowest it altogether. Thou art acquainted with all my ways. God knows everything we do. And God knows everything we speak. Every word of it. For there is not a word in my tongue. But Lord, O Lord, Thou knowest it altogether. Altogether, every word of it. God knows every word that we speak. And we need to be careful with the words that we use. For we are going to be held accountable for every idle word that proceeds out of our mouths. But you know, there's a lot of ways to communicate today. There's texting, emails, posting on Facebook, and on and on. We need to be very careful. That is communicating. And when we text, when we post, when we send an email, we need to be very careful in the words that we use. We are going to give an account for every idle word that proceeds out of our mouths. And it does not have to be verbally. We're going to give an account for these things, and we need to take it very seriously. He says, Thou hast beset me, in verse 5, Thou hast beset me behind and before. The word beset there carries the idea of to besiege, to surround. Just like in the Bible when an army would come against a city and they would surround it, they would besiege it. Cut it off. He's saying, Thou hast beset me behind and before. Any way, direction he might go or we might go, God is there. If we go forward, God's there. If we go backwards, God is there. Thou hast beset me behind and before and laid Thy hand upon me. There is no escaping God. And then he says in verse 6, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. You take and think about what we've already considered. God knows us from conception. He knows the first word we spoke and every word we've spoken since. He knows our first step and every step we've taken ever since. He knows our thoughts afar off before they're even formed. He knows every word that we've spoken. But that's not only true of me, that's true of you. It's not only just true of you, it's true for the billions of people who live upon planet Earth. All at the same time. God knows every word, every action, every thought they have. All at the same time. I do not do well with big crowds. It's too much noise for me. And if 5 people were talking to me at the same time, I probably wouldn't hear a thing any of them said. But just imagine billions of people all speaking at the same time. God hears every word of it. He knows everything they do. He knows when they sit, when they stand, everything they've ever done. Just sit down and try to contemplate that. And then I think you might understand why David says in verse 6, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain unto it. I know people that like to say, I can't wrap my mind around that. This is something that is beyond my comprehension. I try to understand, try to fathom just the omniscience of God, that God knows all these things. But it's beyond what I can understand. It is amazing. He says, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. But then we come to the verse that we are to look at, and that is verse 7. He says, whither shall I go from Thy Spirit, or whither shall I flee from Thy presence? You know, I looked at this as 2 different possibilities. Those that might want to flee from God's presence. And those that might contemplate, where might I go that God will not be? On one hand, it's a concern. They want to flee from God. It's a concern, realizing God knows everything. Where can I flee that He might not see? On the other hand, it is something that is comforting in knowing that God is always there. So you might look at for two perspectives. But there are those who have tried to escape God. When Adam and Eve sinned, when they ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they tried to hide from God. They hid among the trees, it says in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 8. That's foolish. When God told Jonah to go to Nineveh and preach to the people in Nineveh, Jonah got on a ship and tried to sail the other direction pretty much. I think Jonah was trying to hide from doing what God wanted him to do, and really in effect was hiding from God, or trying to. Foolishness. But aren't people just as foolish today? There are some people, and I don't think you have to hide physically for it to be hiding. I think you can hide in your actions and in your thinking, or your lack thereof. But I think there's a lot of people try to hide from God by just trying to say that He does not exist. That's foolish. That's more foolish than Adam and Eve trying to hide among the trees. It's foolish. But there are also those who they do believe there is a God, but they do not acknowledge Him. They do not allow Him to have any part in their lives. They're trying to hide from God in that sense. And that too is foolishness. They may try to shut Him out, but He's still there. There are those who I think are trying to hide from Him when they live in total disobedience to Him, doing the things that He has commanded not to do, and not doing the things He has commanded to do. But I believe they're trying to hide from Him by trying to convince themselves that God really doesn't mean what He says. Oh, they might say, they might say that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God. That the idolaters and adulterers and effeminate and abusers themselves with mankind, thieves and covetous and drunkards shall not inherit. Oh, God doesn't really mean that. That's foolishness. God does mean it. And He is going to hold people accountable. There's no hiding our actions from God. On the other hand, it ought to be comforting to know that there is no place that we can go where God will not be. That ought to be comforting. God has said in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. This world could be a scary place, and I tell you what, this year has been a scary year. But, and there's a lot of scary things we're going to go through in life. But isn't it comforting to know that God is there with us? God's there with us. He'll help us through it. When I was working on this lesson, I ran into this, and I wished I had a chalkboard I could write on here. You understand more of what I'm talking about. But there's a little girl that was in school, and her teacher wrote on the board, God is nowhere. Nowhere. N-O-W-H-E-R-E. And the little girl said, Sir, you forgot to put the space in there. It should have been, God is now here. N-O-W-H-E-R-E. God is now here, not that God is nowhere. If you don't understand what I'm saying, write it out and you'll see it. But I tell you what, that little girl was far smarter than that's proper English, by the way, in Missouri. But that little girl was smarter than her teacher. God is now here, and He is. God is always there. And David is pondering this. He says in verse 8, if I ascend up into heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, which is from the word Sheol, the grave, behold, thou art there. If I go up to heaven or if I'm in the grave, either way, you might say the highest point, the lowest point, God is there. He says in verse 9, if I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. The wings of the morning. Where does the sun come up in the morning? East, isn't it? Where it comes up in my house. It comes up in the east. But if we take the wings of the morning and go to the farthest point of the sea, to the west, God is there. Furthest point east, furthest point west, God is there. So far, as high as you might think, as low as you might think, from the east to the west, God is there. Now, if I'm pointing to that direction and it's not east, forgive me, because I have no sense of direction. But you get the point. My wife pointed that out to me here a while back. But anyway, God's there. There is no escaping Him. But He says there in that verse, if I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. God's there. Isn't that comforting? To know that as we go through this life, most of this life is a wonderful thing. But there are difficult things we go through. I lost a daughter at 29 about 10 years ago now. And I was asked, I'd gone to India on a mission trip, and I was flying back. And I was sitting by this guy, and we were talking, and he asked me where I had been. I said, India, preaching. And he asked me about the family, and I said, well, I have 4 daughters, and one passed away. He says, well, can I ask you a question? I said, well, sure. He said, when your daughter died, did it weaken your faith? I said, no. There was a God before she died. There's a God after she died. But isn't it comforting to know that God is there? He can help us through those times. We can look at it as, if we wanted to escape God, that's a concern. He's always there. But it ought to be comforting as we go through this life, realizing God is there. There is no place that we can go that He will not be. He says in verse 11, if I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, even the night shall be light about me. Yea, the darkness hideth not from thee, but the night shineth as a day. The darkness and the light are both alike to thee. As though David is saying, well, does the darkness hide me from God? The answer is no. Light or dark doesn't make any difference. As several of you know, my wife and I, we have a few acres, and we have chickens. And go out at night, every night, and put the chickens up. And usually there's a light that I can turn on out the chicken house, or I'll take a flashlight. Because I've gone out in that chicken house a couple different times, and I've seen some snakes in that chicken house. And I sure am glad that they weren't hid in the darkness from me, because I couldn't see them without the light. I went out there one night, and then when you go into our chicken house, there's a hallway in the front. And the rooms that the chicken house or chickens are in, there's 2 of them. The doors open from that hallway. And to the right, there's a cage. When I buy new chicks, I put them in there till they get big. They're confined and also protected. But when I don't have the chicks, I put them over there on the right-hand side of that hallway. Well, I went in there one night to put the chickens away. And I noticed out of the corner of my eye something move over there to the right. I thought, well, one of the chickens has got out, and it's perched up there on that cage. So I started to reach over there. I was pretty close to it too, when I realized it had a real long tail. Chickens don't have real long tails, not that kind anyway. It was a possum. And I sure am glad I didn't grab that possum by the tail. Now, my mother-in-law, she would grab it by the tail, and she'd kill that thing. But, and I hope Peter isn't watching. But anyway, that was a possum. And I was glad I didn't grab it by the tail. But the darkness hides things from us. It doesn't hide it from God. You know, there are those who try to do things in the cover of darkness, thinking they can get away with it. No. But we might also, on the other hand, think, is God able to see me even in the darkness? And the answer is yes. It doesn't make any difference. That's what he's saying here. He says, if I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, even the night shall be light about me. Yea, the darkness hideth not from thee, but the night shineth as the day. The darkness and the light are both alike to thee. And then he says in verse 13, for thou hast possessed my reins, thou hast covered me in my mother's womb, as we looked at earlier. When we take and think about all that David is contemplating here, and we think about our God, we have an amazing God. God is omniscient, and He is omnipresent. He knows everything about us, and He is always there for us. God knows the first words we've ever spoken, first step we ever took, every thought when it's still developing, every word we've ever spoke, everything we've ever done, whether good or bad. God knows all these things. But you know, when God made man, God knew that man needed food, didn't He? And God gave us a wide variety of food. God knew that man needed a helpmate, and God made woman. God knew man needed a law to live by, and God gave us a law. God also knew that man would fail in keeping that law. And a transgression of the law is sin, 1 John 3:4. Therefore God also knew that man needed a Savior, and He sent His own Son to die for us. We have an amazing God. I hope you'll think upon these verses, and I hope it'll help you to have a different perspective, a better understanding, and more comfort in the God that we do serve. Thank you.